Welcome to another Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and I'm joined by Mr. Fear Noir himself, Michael Whitehouse. Actually, have you ever thought about changing your name to Michael Noirhouse to help promote the show?
I think Callum once called me Michael Fighthouse, which I quite like.
That's even better. That's good.
How you doing, mate?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. I spent most of this afternoon hanging out a window 2 stories up trying to paint some new windows we've just had installed.
Like Harold Lloyd?
Yeah, pretty much. I ended up crouching on an outside ledge above the street trying to not get paint on the glass while my legs cramped up, which I wouldn't recommend. Ended up we've had to rent a big ladder anyway because there were some bits I just couldn't get.
How big? How big's this ladder?
6 meters.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Saucy.
Saucy. But yeah, I'm glad I can still find ways to put my life at risk without leaving the house. How are you?
I'm fine. I am now. Weight loss update, everyone. I've now lost 22 pounds. So I've
22 pounds. You've turned American on us, Mike.
Well, no, but it's easier just to do it in pounds. It's just easier.
No, it's not.
It's so much easier for tracking your weight loss. Pounds is the way to go.
Almost 2 stone sounds better than. Well, I can't even remember how many pounds you even said there.
22. So over 1.5 stone.
That's pretty good.
I genuinely feel good. I was getting pretty big. The eating had to stop, I'm afraid, as gutted as I am. Although, do you know what's annoyed me is that Saturday night is my cheat night, so I'm allowed...
Are you following the Butterfield diet?
I had ordered a pizza on Saturday night.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. But ever since I've had that pizza, it's like flicked a switch in my body where I've gone from, even though I've been not eating a lot of calories every day, I've not been hungry.
Yeah.
Now, since Saturday night, I've been really, really hungry ever since I had that pizza.
Yeah, stretched your stomach.
Yeah, I think that's what happened. It was glorious though. It was worth it.
Nah, you're doing really well, man. I'm proud of you.
Thank you.
So, this episode is part 2 of Giant Sea Monsters Attack. You don't need to have listened to part 1. We're mostly going to be talking about different cases here, but I might make a few callbacks to stuff that we talked about last time, so feel free to go back and listen to that first. If you want. You don't have to. I'm not your mum. But since we've all been denied our holidays for almost a year now, I thought it might be nice to kick things off somewhere nice and warm. Blue seas, blue skies, golden sands.
Aberdeen.
In the western Atlantic Ocean, southeast of Florida, north of Cuba, lies a cluster of islands known as the Luscan Archipelago. And beneath this sun-speckled paradise, which comprises both the Bahamas and the British overseas territory of Turks and Caicos, there exists a series of distinctive geological features known as blue holes. The archipelago is formed predominantly of large deposits of limestone that once used to sit above the sea. Just like other areas of limestone geology, this rock is eroded out in places and riddled with fissures and caverns and sinkholes. Many of these so-called blue holes, these openings in the rock, come to the surface beneath the surrounding Luscan Sea, and as a result, the interconnected limestone cave systems between the islands are filled with seawater and marine life. From the air, they look like someone took a massive apple corer to the island or the seafloor, leaving this blue hole.
I've seen these and they absolutely terrify me.
They're quite beautiful in their own way,
They're
though.
beautiful, yeah, but you know, the stars are beautiful. I wouldn't want to go for a swimming one. I was just thinking that that's a new name for a reality TV show, Swimming with the Stars. Never mind, I'm sorry.
Johnny Rotten's done 6 lengths. Even miles inland, what at first glance appears to be a large circular freshwater lake a few hundred feet across, can in fact be a vast sinkhole up to 1,000 feet deep, with a layer of freshwater floating on top of the mass of denser, heavier, salty seawater beneath.
This gives me the fear.
And connected via fissures and narrow caves to other blue holes and to the sea itself. Now, blue holes are particularly widespread on Andros. This island has 50 known blue holes in the surrounding seabed and just under 200 on the island itself. Some of these mysterious voids have been investigated by divers in what is an extremely challenging and dangerous cave diving environment once you get down past the open water and into the jagged, labyrinthine maze of limestone below. But the majority remain largely unexplored, and the connections between them almost entirely uncharted. From the surface, these blue holes are idyllic, inviting the perfect place for a refreshing swim, and people do swim in them. Some are even tourist attractions. Some are set up with diving platforms and facilities for snorkelers and bathers, but nevertheless, in some quarters, they have a more ominous reputation than their surface appearance would suggest. There is a running theme in local folklore that the blue holes are a more dangerous place to go swimming than the sea or a river or an ordinary lake. There's talk of a high rate of disappearances among swimmers in these otherwise enclosed bodies of water, apparent drownings or animal attacks where no body has ever been recovered. And there are local legends of creatures resembling strange sharks, immense octopuses, and bizarrely, even apparent hybrids of the two creatures living in these blue holes and the networks of tunnels connecting them.
That's it, I'm out. A shark octopus.
These legends, disappearances, and sightings are claimed to be evidence of a creature known as the Lusca. In a 2016 episode of the Animal Planet TV show River Monsters, Jeremy Wade presented an incident in which a young boy disappeared while swimming with his friends in a remote inland blue hole. Unfortunately, the episode is quite light on specifics like names and dates, so we have to be a little careful about reading too much into it. But from what I can gather, sometime in the early 2010s, 3 kids climbed down to the edge of a blue hole in the south of Andros. They jumped in and started swimming and horsing around, initially at the shallow edge of the sinkhole, safely away from where the bottom plunges off into the abyss. This is a place they would swim on a regular basis. There seemed to be nothing menacing or dangerous or out of the ordinary. They're playing with a ball. They're tossing it back and forth. A missed throw, the ball finds itself floating out in deep water. One of the lads swims out to retrieve it, and he disappears, as though something reached up and yanked him down into the depths. A member of the search party who was interviewed on the programme said, 3 kids left and 2 came back. We found nothing. We didn't find any remains, no clothing, nothing. And it goes to the folklore, the Lusca has taken him. And again, that's just one instance. Judging by the buzz around this topic online, it would seem that reports of fishermen being pulled in and disappearing, divers vanishing, swimmers being dragged away seem to be rife here. I was also able to find a report in the Nassau Guardian of a 19-year-old man who disappeared in very similar circumstances while swimming in Dean's Blue Hole on Long Island, another of the Bahamas, on May the 13th, 2012, the deepest of the inland blue holes, again, diving under and failing to surface. Jeremy Wade also interviewed a deep-sea fisherman called Tamer, who described happening upon a strange creature while fishing for Dorado. Tamer initially thought what he was looking at was a shark, but as he and his crew got closer, they began to notice something unusual about this shark, if shark it was. The creature, as Tamer described it, was, quote, a strange animal with tentacles and the head of a shark. He describes the entire animal as 8 feet in length, with a pointed snout like a mako shark, with tentacles then trailing from a body behind that. Something I can't not mention, quite similar in appearance to the creature in that cinematic masterpiece, Sharktopus.
Was this before or after that?
So this is like a long-standing piece of folklore around Andros, and in some versions of the story, far predating those movies, this creature is a hybrid of both shark and octopus. But Tamer's sighting is by no means the only one. It sounds completely ridiculous, and I should say, the Lusca isn't always described this way, but nevertheless, This idea of a half shark, half octopus monster seems to be a very enduring piece of folklore in the Aleutian Islands. And unlike, say, the Kraken, which was described in all manner of different ways, we think of the Kraken as being a squid-like or octopus-like creature. But if you look at the actual descriptions of Kraken in Scandinavian folklore, they're really all over the place. Depending on the source, it can be like a crab-like creature, it can be a whale-like creature.
A really, really grumpy old man.
But even when the Lusca is described in a different way to the half-octopus thing, it has a certain visual continuity with that. For example, in some traditions, the Lusca is described not as an animal, but as an evil spirit of the blue holes, and this spirit supposedly appears not as a half shark, half octopus, but half woman with hair so long it trails in the water, entangling the limbs of her victims and dragging them down to die. So there is a certain commonality with the octopus legend, you know, the tendrils, the tentacles.
That really sounds so much like when you do get something mentioned in myth or folklore and it genuinely comes from something, you know, someone has seen something that had appendages or something dragging off of it, and then that description, that experience works its way into the folklore, and as usual, women get blamed.
Yeah.
This is a running theme with a lot of folklore.
Yeah.
Just that really strikes me. It really feels that way. Like something that was really seen and then has made its way into the folklore.
Absolutely. Of course, that doesn't mean it's more likely to be true necessarily, but yeah, it is interesting. Even with all the variations, there's still kind of a focus on certain physical characteristics of the thing. The idea of the Lusca being a hybrid of octopus and shark does come with a few obvious problems. The main one being octopus are mollusks, they're invertebrates. Sharks are vertebrates, cartilaginous fishes. They're not just different species, they're different families, classes, phyla. They're about as far apart on the tree of life as it's possible to get and still both be animals.
Mate, it can't get in the way of love.
I'm not saying sparks couldn't fly, but for there to be an actual productive crossbreeding hybrid of these two animals, that doesn't seem to be a credible outcome no matter how you look at it. So what sort of possibilities does that leave us with? Perhaps the simplest explanation would be that, you know, the Lusca is just a bogeyman that's arisen as a way of scaring children away from playing alone in stretches of water that might be dangerous. There are reasons other than monsters to be at least careful and wary of these environments, particularly with regards to diving down below the surface. The underwater connections with the sea that these blue holes have can lead to unexpected currents, tidal effects. There are even reports of small boats being pulled down by tidal vortices. Furthermore, as I've said, these deep basins have layers of fresh water on top of denser salt water. In some blue holes, this layer where the salt water and fresh water meet one another acts as a trap for large amounts of hydrogen sulfide, also known as swamp gas. This gas is the byproduct of dead animals and plants rotting over thousands of years. I'm not an expert in this stuff, but from what I can gather, it doesn't dissolve in fresh water quite so readily as it does in salt water. So what you then end up having is huge amounts of it accumulate where it's bubbled up through the seawater and then hit the less penetrable layer of fresh water. When inhaled, hydrogen sulfide can kill. Luckily, under the water, you're not going to be breathing it in directly. Or if you are, you know, you've got other problems. But if you were to dive down and hit a dense layer of hydrogen sulfide bubbles, with it going up your nose and into your eyes and your mouth and your soft tissues and everything, that can very quickly cause nausea, burning eyes and skin, disorientation. Cave divers who have explored blue holes describe passing through this halocline layer, it's called. They've described it as an utterly horrific experience, and it's something that they're expecting when they go down there. So I have to wonder, someone diving down with no protective equipment, probably not prepared for the shock of hitting this full layer. You know, it takes you by surprise. Maybe the shock causes you to gasp and take in a lungful of seawater, or you lose orientation. It's easy to see how that could put a swimmer in a life-threatening situation. I also wonder, just on that line of thought, if in certain circumstances this multi-layered water column might also prevent other things from rising all the way to the surface, such as drowned bodies. Could something like that explain why the bodies of missing swimmers sometimes aren't recovered from these holes? I think the particular attributes of these holes should definitely be considered as potentially contributing to these cases of disappearing swimmers, but assuming for the purposes of this that animal attacks are responsible for some of these incidents, and assuming that the animals responsible have at least some remote resemblance to the Lusca of folklore, what might we be dealing with here? Well, it's no secret that tiger sharks are common in the area. These are the second most deadly shark species to humans after the white shark. According to the Florida Program for Shark Research, there were 661 recorded unprovoked shark attacks worldwide between 2010 and 2019, of which about 7% were fatal. About 15% of shark fatalities overall are attributed to the tiger shark, so that seems like a lot, but you're really only looking at a handful of tiger shark fatalities a year across the whole planet. However, according to Gavin Naylor, director of the Florida Program for Shark Research, the recorded numbers are considerably underestimated due to the fact that reports heavily favour developed countries, presumably also due to cases where no body is recovered or there's no witnesses. Tiger sharks would have no problem pulling a swimmer under, and they are often seen in the undersea blue holes.
Just when you were talking about the description of the animal, and I know that there are many sharks that have a symbiotic relationship with these cleaner fish. I don't know the exact name for them, but I'm sure there are many different species, and the sharks themselves kind of become almost like mini ecologies where there are these fish latching onto them and they sort of trail off of them. And it's just strikes me that this idea of seeing something that looks like a shark but it has tentacles or things dragging off of it in the water, that it could be something like that.
So these fish are like elongated forms that seem to be hanging off the shark. Yeah, that's actually a really, really interesting insight. The problem with tiger sharks is that they're almost certainly too large to navigate and maneuver in the narrow limestone passages through the rock. When we talk about these bodies of water being joined to the sea by caves, we might think of big caverns and grottos, and there are sections like that, but I think the vast majority of these connections are more like a honeycomb of waterlogged cracks and fissures, like jagged, pitch black cavities in many places measured probably in centimetres rather than metres.
I can't think of anywhere I'd rather not be. I'm fascinated by cave divers, incidentally, and I've watched documentaries about them and read a little bit about some of their experiences, and it's incredible what they do. But at the same time, just that idea of being, especially when you see how many of them become disorientated.
Yeah.
Oh, it terrifies me.
You're right, and they have explored parts of these systems, but the vast majority of the actual connections aren't like a navigable space at all. A cave diver couldn't get down them, much less. Things like tiger sharks really need open water to swim. I think it's maybe conceivable that one could swim in as a baby and then grow to an adult size in there, except that once it was in there and grown large enough to take down a human, it's then stuck in that enclosed body of water. The sharks would still be in there, at least as far as the inland holes go, so they wouldn't be able to get back out or swim from hole to hole. Divers and fishermen would have found them trapped in the blue holes inland, and they haven't.
You wonder if there is any sort of isolated evolutionary quirks of places like that.
Almost certainly, yeah. But if there is an animal taking down swimmers in these blue holes, it has to be something that's powerful enough to pull down a human being, but also small enough or supple enough to be able to use these exceedingly narrow limestone passageways to get around. And to find something that fits that bill, I think we have to look at the other half of the Lusca, the octopus. Octopuses are completely boneless, and because they're so elastic, they can compress their bodies through minuscule spaces relative to their normal relaxed size. The only rigid part of their anatomy is the beak. Like their squid cousins, they possess a hard, sharp beak. Unlike squid, and unlike cuttlefish, octopus lack the rigid chitinous pen inside the mantle, which is the evolutionary remnant of the external shell that their common ancestors would have had. Octopuses have only the tiniest rudimentary leftover of that, like a tiny pebble. In squid, the pen serves as an attachment point for various muscle groups. But without this organ, octopus are far more squeezable. That's the scientific term, you see.
Squishy.
Yeah. It's really only the size of the beak and the compressibility of the animal's flesh and muscles and organs that limits how small a space it can crawl through. For example, a 1 meter 50 pound or 22 kilogram octopus can squeeze through a 5 centimeter hole. That's 2 inches. Most octopus species are agile and active predators. They are fantastically, almost frighteningly intelligent. Several species exhibit behaviour and intellectual abilities not seen in other invertebrates, even activities that traditionally would only have been associated with primates, such as the use of tools. Some are even capable, according to one study, of observational learning. So, if a powerful enough octopus, or, as you say, a genetic offshoot, decided humans were tasty, and if they've been around maybe long enough to recognise the kind of human activity that results when a swimmer is taken, boats, divers, what have you, and if the animal is actively trying to avoid detection, it sounds fantastical, and it is. Don't mistake me here, I'm not suggesting premeditated murder by octopus is the most likely explanation, but something like that could be an outside possibility, and it certainly makes more sense in a lot of ways than large sharks prowling these inland waters. Many species of octopus have the ability to change their colour and texture of their bodies to mimic features in their environment. Imagine a huge deadly creature, a true shape-shifting chameleon that can blend into rocks or a mud bank to hide or to hunt.
These descriptions really
Scare the pants
make
off
the
me.
hairs stand up in the back of my neck. All these scenarios, and there's something about the deep sea. As much as I love the sea, the deep sea, it stirs a primal fear in me.
Well, we're getting good value out of this story then, that's good to know.
Talk about butterflies, please.
A gigantic octopus would have a lot less difficulty navigating the labyrinth than even a small shark, and it potentially has the smarts to know not to stick around afterwards, and the right physical attributes to be able to make itself scarce. What's more, if you look at, for example, the giant Pacific octopus, these are the largest known octopuses, and it should be said they don't eat people and they live a long way from the Bahamas. But these animals, when they lift off from the bottom and swim mid-water, they move with their tentacles behind, their mantle leading in the water. And as pointed out by Jeremy Wade in the River Monsters episode, the soft mantle often takes on a vaguely shark head shaped profile while doing this. The tentacles trail behind, with the overall profile of the body held in this position being not too dissimilar from the general shape of the shark, except for where it breaks up into tentacles at the back.
Are there not theories about how some squid or octopuses may shape their bodies like that, so that maybe other predators might actually think it's a shark?
Right. So like mimicry almost.
Yeah.
That's a really great point. The issue though is that there are no obvious contenders for huge octopus species living in this area, at least not that have been reliably documented. The giant Pacific octopus's range is separated from this area by the whole of the North American continent. The biggest octopus commonly found in the immediate vicinity of these islands, probably the Caribbean reef octopus, grows to maybe 4 or 5 feet, just over a metre in total span across the tentacles, far too small to pose a serious threat to a human being, and it eats like small fish, crab, lobsters, that kind of thing. Now that's not to say that there couldn't be something bigger, perhaps an undiscovered species living in the caves and cavities under Andros and some of the other Luscian islands. In fact, the hidden, labyrinthine inaccessibility of these underground marine environments makes them a much more credible, much more likely habitat for a possible cryptid than almost any other I can think of off the top of my head. You can't really go down there to, see it. Due to this being underground, Underwater, due to the restrictive scale of the tunnels, their sheer multitude, by the complete darkness, by the clouds of blinding mud and acrid chemicals, this environment is not only unexplored, but we are borderline incapable of exploring large parts of it with our current technology. In detail, at least. People can cave dive, as we've said, some tiny sections of it, at great risk to their lives. Maybe we can get a bit further in using underwater drones. Geologists might be able to map out larger caverns and maybe get some idea of like the average prevalence of smaller cavities using seismic mapping and that kind of thing. But to really explore them and map them, it would be like trying to explore and map the holes in a kitchen sponge, you know. The fact that these spaces are so largely unexplored and the fact that they are such specialized environments, I have no doubt in my mind that there are new species waiting to be discovered down there. There are already lots of unique species of polychaete worms and isopods and flora and fauna known from these environments. I've got zero doubt that there's more to be discovered down there. I'm not saying that I think giant monster octopuses are definitely among those. I'm not even saying it's very likely. These are extreme, low oxygen, high sulfur environments. It would be tough for something large and high maintenance to find enough nutrients to survive down there, assuming it spent most of its time in the carbonate karst caves, but nature has a habit of surprising us. Do I think the legend of the Lusca and the disappearances associated with it are traceable back to a single creature or species of animal? Well, I don't know. The skeptic in me says it's premature to go pointing the finger at specific animals over a pattern that isn't really strongly established as far as I can tell. I would like to see some actual statistics about the rates of disappearances and drownings in the blue holes. Maybe some confirmation that there really is a much higher rate here than the sort of world average, because I've got a bit of a suspicion that it's actually being exaggerated a little bit. Scientifically speaking, I think the best place to start is by first establishing whether there even is a case to be answered, because I haven't come across any hard figures. Not saying they don't exist, but I haven't been able to find any. So this all does feel a wee bit anecdotal. Yes, some locals do maintain that people go missing in the inland blue holes at a rate that suggests something sinister is going on, at least according to documentaries and YouTube videos on the subject they do. But I really haven't been able to find the expected wealth of news reports to back that up particularly. When a freediver from New York, Nicholas Mivoli, died in an accident in Dean's Blue Hole in 2013 during a diving competition, the Nassau Guardian in its story on the event mentioned, quote, "At least 4 deaths have been recorded in the last 5 years at Dean's Blue Hole, which is known as the world's deepest blue hole. One of these was the disappearance of the 19-year-old swimmer that I mentioned earlier, whose body was never recovered. But that's really the only one of the 4 that matches the supposed MO of this creature, or 5, including the diver. Nicholas Mivoli's body was recovered. In fact, he surfaced of his own accord and then lost consciousness, according to the report. He had actually been attempting to break the free immersion depth record at the time, and he just free dived to 72 metres before coming back up. It was later reported that Mivoli died by immersion pulmonary edema, a condition where there's a sudden overproduction of fluid in the lungs, sometimes known as dry drowning. Tragically, it's a very common cause of lung injury and, unfortunately, sometimes death in freedivers, so there's no implication of anything unusual there in that case. And the others were the simple drowning deaths of a 41-year-old and 45-year-old woman along with a 14-year-old girl. Nothing but a tragic accident. They'd been paddling along the shallow shoreline around the hole. The 14-year-old girl, Deirdre Major, wandered unawares into the hole itself, and presumably not being a strong swimmer, she was unable to get back out. And then her mother and her mother's friend, Faye Major and Renee Pinder, had gone in to assist her, and they also got into difficulty in the unexpectedly deep water.
That's terrible.
Awful. A day out that ended in disaster, I'm sad to say. But again, the bodies were recovered. There were no signs of animal attack or anything of that nature. So, in this one blue hole, out of 5 fatalities in 5 years, only 1 actually involved the disappearance or had any sort of mystery to it. Furthermore, according to the Tribune, another Bahamian newspaper, prior to the 2008 tragedy, there had been no drownings or disappearances in or around there for 6 years prior to that. That's a better safety record than most Glasgow swimming pools. So, yes, that's just one of these blue holes. The creature is supposed to move around between them. So it doesn't really disprove anything, but it just makes me think, these incidents in Dean's blue hole are some of the very few I've been able to find any sort of corroboration for in terms of records and news stories. And from what I've seen and read, from the way a lot of commentators, including the likes of Jeremy Wade, had presented this, I had been led to believe, I really expected there to be like a lot more reported disappearances. And I mean, these holes are common swimming and diving spots. There are elementary schools in the Aleutian Islands that use nearby blue holes for teaching kids to swim, for goodness sake. So I find that hard to square with the hype.
Yeah, I mean, it could also be, though, that if what you were talking about, an animal that either is an octopus or something similar to it, that's evolved in isolation down there, if its primary habitat is deep down in these fissures, then you could say that the few accounts of people disappearing are simply because these things actually only come out very often.
Rarely.
I mean, sometimes animals go into a completely different environment only to reproduce and then go elsewhere, So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that's likely, but I'm just saying it could be used to explain that.
You're definitely right. Still, though, there's still the hurdle of these bodies of water having, the tidal effects and unpredictable currents and noxious gas layers and stuff. That's still something that hurdle that needs to be jumped over to show that any effects weren't also due to that. But yeah, you're right. I'm not writing it off here. But on the other side of the scales, though, there is some, albeit kind of flaky evidence of larger octopus in these waters. On January the 20th, 2011, the Freeport News out of Grand Bahama reported that the mangled remains of just such a creature were washed up at Williamstown Beach near the Island Seas Resort. This is not in a blue hole, it's on the coast, but remember, the blue holes exist in the sea as well as inland. According to a local fisherman by the name of Dudley Bethel, I saw that the octopus was washed up on the shore. It was pretty big and I was a bit concerned. I knew what it was because as a fisherman we see a lot of them out there in the water, but they are not as big as this. He noted that the carcass showed visible bite wounds and speculated that it had been attacked by a shark. The Assistant Fisheries Superintendent of the Department of Marine Resources, man, why can't I have a job with a title like that?
What a title.
Clement Campbell was among those who observed the remains. He stated that it was not the first large octopus corpse that had been washed up on the island around that time, and was in fact the second in less than half a year. He said, based on what the predators left behind, it is believed that it could have been between 20 and 30 feet long. The only thing that was left was the mouth and a portion of the head. All of the tentacles were gone. So, very much a partial carcass. And we know that it's a risky thing to extrapolate too boldly about a full-size animal from a few small, mutilated and potentially distorted parts, as we discussed in the last episode. But if that's true, 20 to 30 feet, 6 to 9 meters, still a little short of the 75 feet or even 200 feet that some have claimed for the Lusca, but that would put it on a par with the most massive giant Pacific octopus ever found, a 30-foot long chonker that was found on the coast of British Columbia, and is itself quite a controversial record. According to Clement Campbell, no testing was done on the corpse because it was so badly damaged, which is a shame because I think a DNA sample could have proved quite illuminating there.
Yeah.
One potential candidate for that particular find is the 7-arm octopus, probably the second largest octopus species, a creature that does exist in the Atlantic. Unlike the giant Pacific octopus, the 7-arm octopus is a deep-dwelling animal that's rarely found on the surface, usually being trawled up along with deep-sea fishing catch, although being eaten and coughed up by a shark might explain how it got to the beach. Alternatively, it could well be a member of an unknown species connected to the nearby blue holes. Until more carcasses are found, someone bothers to do some proper analysis on them, we'll never know for sure. So yeah, the Lusca, for the time being, I'm leaning towards it just being some colourful folklore, but I'm going to be charitable and say there are one or two intriguing things here around the edges that leave the door open just a crack. One interesting thing, though, that feeds into that is that for its lack of known giant octopus species, the Caribbean and the adjacent parts of the North Atlantic do seem to be a bit of a hotspot for giant octopus lore. Not terribly far away from the Aleutian Islands, about 350 miles to the northwest of Andros and about 600 miles northwest of Dean's Blue Hole on the Long Island, is St. Augustine Beach, Florida. This town is situated on Anastasia Island, a barrier island separated from mainland Florida and St. Augustine City by Matanzas Bay. At the time of this story, 1896, the first bridge from the mainland had only just opened to the public a year before, so this was still a pretty remote area. It was just starting to be developed. On November the 30th, two young boys named Herbert Coles and Dunham Carreter were cycling on Anastasia Island when they noticed something large lying on the beach. They assumed this object to be a stranded whale, and when they crossed back home to the city of St. Augustine, they reported it to Dr. DeWitt Webb, head of the St. Augustine Historical Society and Institute of Science. The following day, Webb attended the scene and observed the thing on the sands. It was indeed the mutilated and highly decomposed remains of some immense animal. It was a pale whitish pink in colour, bordering on iridescent silver when catching the sun. Its texture was rubbery and extremely tough. The weight of the object was such that it had partially sunken into the sand, but the section of the carcass that he could directly observe above the surface measured 6 metres, 18 feet in length, and 2.5 metres, 7 feet in width. He estimated that the remains were approximately 5 tons in weight, and bearing in mind that this was a much deteriorated and mutilated remnant, the animal in life must have been considerably larger and heavier than these measurements. The corpse was thick and bulbous at one end, tapering off slightly towards the other, where 4 truncated, branching structures were visible protruding from the body above the sand. These he took to be the severed stumps of tentacles, or to use the correct scientific term, arms. Not far from the remains, he found another strip of decomposing flesh that he believed to be the remnant of another arm. Webb concluded that the remains were those of a gigantic octopus. He arranged for a number of photographs to be taken of the mass, and I think probably many of our listeners will have seen these over the years in books and magazines and online. If you haven't, you can check them out at the St. Augustine Monster Wikipedia page, which has most of the images. However, there were other interpretations of the mass. A Dr. George Grant, who owned a nearby hotel, also observed the object and wrote a description that was later published in the Pennsylvania Grit newspaper. The head is as large as an ordinary flour barrel. We all know the size of a flour barrel, right, Mike?
Of course. I have 2 of them in the garden.
And has the shape of a sea lion head. The neck, if the creature may be said to have a neck, is of the same diameter as the body. The mouth is on the underside of the head and is protected by 2 tentacle tubes about 8 inches in diameter and about 30 feet long. These tubes resemble an elephant's trunk and obviously were used to clutch in a sucker-like fashion any object within their reach. Another tube or tentacle of the same dimension stands out on top of the head. 2 others, one on each side, protrude from beyond the monster's neck and extend fully 15 feet along with the body and beyond the tail. The tail, which is separated and jagged with cutting points for several feet, is flanked with 2 more tentacles of the same dimensions as the others and 30 feet long. The eyes are under the back of the mouth instead of over it. This specimen is so badly cut up by sharks and sawfish that only the stumps of the tentacles remain, but pieces of them were found strewn for some distance on the beach, showing that the animal had a fierce battle with its foes before it was disabled and beached by the surf. So, he seems to be describing some sort of roughly fish-shaped thing with a tail and with tentacles sticking out all over it. Truly bizarre. And this is part of the problem with unrecognisably mutilated carcasses like this. They become a bit of a Rorschach test. They can be interpreted a number of different ways and reflect the preconceptions of the observer. Grant's account was reproduced in the newspaper with a very fanciful drawing that seems to be based on the written description but doesn't actually resemble the photos, presumably because the draftsman who created the image hadn't seen the photos. They showed a weird cyclops-looking thing with very well-preserved tentacles trailing up the beach and a huge mouth. Actually, not too far off being a convincing Lusca if it had been an accurate picture, which it wasn't. The carcass remained in situ for over a month when, on January the 9th, 1897, a storm hit the coast and the remains were washed back out to sea. 6 days later, it was washed up again a couple of miles south of where it originally came ashore. Concerned the find might be lost permanently, Dr. Webb arranged for a team of men and horses to move the monster to a safer location. They ended up transporting it near to Dr. Grant's hotel on South Beach, where, apparently, according to some reports, it remained for months or even years, and even became a minor tourist attraction. I've been unable to find what happened to the carcass, but it was disposed of at some point. I can only imagine it must have stank the place up something fierce.
Pickled that bad boy.
I bet the local schoolboys had a field day telling each other, "Your mum smells like the St. Augustine monster." "Your mum is the St. Augustine monster."
Martin, please, for the sake of our listeners.
The case did receive its share of attention from reporters, but by the time the 20th century rolled around, and for over half a century thereafter, the stranding was pretty much forgotten about. That is until 1957, when none other than our old pal from the last episode, Dr. Forrest Glenn Woodmichael,
yes,
the man who was clearly born to be a geography teacher but went into zoology instead, discovered an ancient newspaper cutting discussing the stranding. As a scientist, a biologist, and one of the founders of the International Society of Cryptozoology, Wood was intrigued by this report, and on researching it further, was excited to discover that a tissue sample had been taken from the remains and preserved at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Dr. Wood was able to convince the Smithsonian to send part of the sample to Dr. Joseph Gennaro Jr. at the University of Florida, a cell biologist. Now, this was many years before DNA sequencing was available to researchers. Gennaro's analysis of the sample was based primarily on microscopic comparison of the tissue against control samples from octopus, squid, and whale flesh. This is a process known as comparative histological analysis, essentially observing and comparing the microscopic structures that make up tissues. Gennaro concluded that the tissue did not belong to a whale, did not belong to a giant squid, that it did indeed most closely resemble octopus tissue. In his determination, as printed in the March 1971 issue of Natural History, quote, "The evidence appears unmistakable that the St. Augustine sea monster was in fact an octopus, but the implications are fantastic. Even though the sea presents us from time to time with strange and astonishing phenomena, the idea of a gigantic octopus with arms 75 to 100 feet in length and about 18 inches in diameter at the base, a total spread of some 200 feet, is difficult to comprehend." In 1986, another familiar name, Dr. Roy Mackal of the University of Chicago, entered the debate. You may recall him from our episodes on the Loch Ness Monster. We're still not quite in the DNA testing era, but Mackal performed biochemical analysis on the remains. This is a more advanced technique than histological analysis, but it's a lot more of a blunt instrument than actual DNA sequencing. It doesn't give that kind of clear-cut certainty, and it still requires quite a bit of interpretation to get a meaningful conclusion from it. This involves breaking down the sample in acid and then measuring how much of each amino acid is left in the residue, and then comparing against the amount produced by control samples of different species. Mackal also arrived at the conclusion that the tissue was most closely resembling the sample of octopus flesh, although admittedly he seems to be in a bit more equivocal in that conclusion than Gennaro. So for quite some time, really since Gennaro's 1971 study, the St. Augustine monster hovered over discussions of sea monsters in cryptozoology. The fact that there appeared to be at least some reliable scientific evidence for the existence of an immense kraken-scale octopus living in the Atlantic off northern Florida, as mind-blowing as that sounds. But then, as we so often find on Talking Till Dawn, there came a catch.
Oh, no pun intended.
Between 1995 and 2004, Professor Sidney Pierce from the University of South Florida led an extensive series of studies examining a number of so-called globsters, These huge, indistinct, organic masses like the St. Augustine monster that from time to time wash up on shores around the world. They're often likened to giant octopus carcasses due to them very often lacking bones and having a sort of shapeless form. Pearce utilised both electron microscopy and a more advanced type of biochemical analysis. In the case of the St. Augustine monster sample, the team concluded that they were, quote, masses of virtually pure collagen that do not have the biochemical characteristics of invertebrate collagen, nor the collagen fibre arrangement of octopus mantle. There is no evidence to support the existence of Octopus giganteus, and concluded that these were, quote, the remains of a whale, likely the entire skin or blubber layer, nothing more or less. And their findings for other globsters were much the same.
Gutted.
Yeah, this is the current scientific consensus on the matter of the St. Augustine monster, and globsters in general. These are the remains of whales or basking sharks or similar creatures that have died, and in the process of decomposition, they become difficult to identify as the creature they once were. In the case of a whale, often decomposition separates the skeleton and musculature, which is very heavy, from the buoyant blubber and hide. The bones and other organs fall to the sea bottom. The floaty parts end up bobbing around the surface and eventually wash ashore if they're not completely consumed by scavengers. In the case of large sharks, the neck and gills can rot away, leaving an exposed spinal column sticking out of a decomposed body, leaving the whole thing looking a bit like a plesiosaur corpse or something. With the loss of the St. Augustine monster as like the poster boy for mystery carcasses, I'm not sure that really leaves any of the truly giant globsters unexplained. There are those who disagree with Pearce's findings. As robust as I think his conclusions are, I still would like to see like a full genomic sequencing done on the tissue sample to really put the issue to bed. I don't know why that hasn't been done. Maybe the samples are just too old and deteriorated for that to work. But yeah, I guess we have an answer, we should probably accept it. But to some at least, the St. Augustine carcass remains a subject of controversy. While researching this though, this topic in general, I stumbled by chance upon an image that immediately triggered a memory of having seen it before several years ago. It was a painting on Google Images of a giant octopus attacking a lighthouse. I knew I had seen it somewhere before. I did a bit of poking around in a reverse image search, which jogged my memory. 10 years ago, in 2011, a writer by the name of Matt Salisbury wrote a 2-part article in Fortean Times, the legendary magazine of weird news, phenomena and culture. An article that looked back upon an earlier publication by the name of World of Wonder. World of Wonder was a 70s sort of science, geography, history and technology magazine aimed at teenagers and older children. But Salisbury was particularly interested in a recurring feature in the magazine called Strange Stories. This was their showcase for historical events that were bizarre, offbeat, macabre, sometimes straying into cryptozoology and famous Fortean mysteries and hoaxes. It was the Talk Until Dawn section of the magazine, essentially. While certainly celebrating the drama and wonder of such cases, as a primarily science-oriented magazine, the Strange Stories section took a gently sceptical view, offering rational explanations where they could be found for the more far-out stories, not shying away from being honest about cases that had been debunked, again probably much like the approach of this podcast. Which makes it stand out all the more that in the August 1973 issue of World of Wonder, number 179, Strange Stories related an incident in which a truly immense octopus attacked and killed a lighthouse keeper in the Western Caribbean, on land no less. And it was that issue's cover story. Salisbury had included this cover artwork along with just a very brief mention of the case in his 14 Times essay on World of Wonder, and this was where I'd seen the picture before. So my curiosity was piqued. I was in the process of researching this topic, and this seemed like an absolutely mind-boggling case, and one that had the potential to completely turn on its head our perception of topics like the St. Augustine monster and the Lusca, if there was even a substantial grain of truth to the story, as it was described in passing in Salisbury's article. But something strange. Searching for this case online, yielded only the World of Wonder issue, the artwork for the World of Wonder issue on some sites selling poster art, Matt Salisbury's article on World of Wonder, and that was it. No Wikipedia, no mentions on cryptozoology sites, nothing from Google Books. I even did a search on newspapers.com. Among hundreds of thousands of newspaper back issues held on there, nothing. And yet, World of Wonder seemed, for the most part, pretty legit in the topics it covered. Either genuine cases, or at the very least, they were discussing established folklore. So then I started to wonder, could this be a forgotten case? Something that has slipped through the cracks of internet age study, something first reported in poorly archived non-English language newspapers in the start of the 20th century when it's claimed to have happened.
Detective Martin Yates is on the case. This is what I love.
Well, you know, I'm sure there are things like that are hidden out there.
I'm more like Inspector Clouseau, incidentally.
So is this just something that fell into obscurity, but unlike the St. Augustine monster, never has been rescued from that obscurity by curious researchers, only resurfacing in this one magazine article in the 70s before being forgotten again? If true, that would be a pretty big deal. So, I went onto eBay and I bought myself a copy of World of Wonder issue 179. Finally, I was able to read the full story of the monster of Serrana Cay. The events supposedly took place in October 1905 to a pair of keepers stationed at a tiny 2-story steel frame lighthouse on an island identified in the article as Serrana Cay. This location is more commonly referred to in English as Serrana Bank, as it's actually a series of small islands or cays clustered together. It's unclear which of the islands this is supposed to have happened on, although there is an automated light on Southwest Cay which may have replaced the manned lighthouse in question here. According to the World of Wonder account, one of the keepers, Diego Alves, was on night watch when he felt an unexpected tremor run through the lighthouse. Alves looked out into the night, but could see only moonlight glinting on the sea and stony shore. The next morning, he and his companion Ferdinand Moxo, who had slept through the tremor, went down to investigate, expecting to find that one of the metal structure's tripod legs had begun to subside. But no, everything was in order, the foundations were solid, they chalked it up to a minor earthquake, and forgot about it. A few days later, Moxo was on duty. He was coming to the end of his day shift, and he was cooking a meal in the galley while Alves slept, when the frame of the building began violently shaking. Moxo roused Alves and the pair went outside onto the exterior platform of the lighthouse to see what was happening. They looked down and to their horror saw, quote, an enormous black mass was hauling itself out of the sea. Gigantic tentacles radiated from the centre of the beast and gripped one of the supports, shaking the building dangerously. The two men stood frozen with terror as the horrible beast slithered onto the rocky ledge. It was an octopus of monstrous size. The keepers recovered their scattered wits and rushed inside the building. They both grabbed rifles and ran back to the rail. They must try to kill the awful beast before it pulled the lighthouse to pieces. Both men fired at the glistening mass spread out on the rock. A pair of baleful yellow eyes looked up and fixed themselves on the keepers. Suddenly, one of the monster's long tentacles snaked up towards the men, who jumped back as the serpent limb, thick as a tree trunk, smacked onto the steel rail and twisted it out of shape. Then another shining black coil rose in the air, its horrible suckers groping blindly for an object to fasten on. The tentacles darted towards Alves, gripping him about the waist, and lifted the screaming man into the air. Moxo, shocked into action by the plight of his mate, resumed firing at the body of the octopus below. But as the tentacle which gripped Alves withdrew to the main mass, Moxo stopped firing lest he hit his friend. As Alves disappeared screaming below, Moxo's courage finally deserted him, and he rushed into the lighthouse and locked the door. He lay on the boards quaking with fear, expecting every minute to see a searching black coil break through a window, but it never came. Later, according to the article, Moxo built up the courage to go back outside and look over the railings again. The octopus was still there, but Diego Alves was gone. Two of the creature's arms still trailed around one of the support struts, but the beast itself lay motionless, It had succumbed at last to the repeated gunfire Moxo had rained upon it. A rollicking adventure story, perhaps a little too close to a Jules Verne set piece in terms of the events.
Yeah, I was going to say, was it brought to us by Ray Harryhausen? Do you know what struck me there for a second was there's one of H.P. Lovecraft's earliest stories, Dagon, when the protagonist is sitting in the hospital at the end and is thinking about something coming up at the window.
We're not done yet. When the ship arrived to relieve the two men, Moxo was found wandering the island near to insanity. The sailors listened to his ramblings about a great sea monster, but found it difficult to believe him. Again, bit of an H.P. Lovecraft trope creeping in here as well. So the sailors initially assume that Alves has been carried away by a freak wave, which Moxo mistook for a monster, but then, as they're finalising the handover, the tide recedes, and they're able to observe a huge, rotten carcass floating by the island. Now, yeah, it's a wild story. There's elements of Jules Verne and a little bit of H.P. Lovecraft, as you very acutely noticed there. The lone survivor being found raving and insane. There's also a few things that put me in mind of the movie The Lighthouse, which was the last film I saw at the cinema about 6,000 years ago. Being able to actually read the story as printed didn't really confirm or deny the doubts I had. There's a few fiction-like tropes. The octopus behaves in a very monster-like, kaiju-like way, almost attacking the lighthouse itself. If it really happened, it's such a sensational thing that I find it surprising that the press wouldn't have made more of it at the time.
Yeah.
The style in which it's written is very boy's own adventure. There's no attribution, no sources to follow up on. However, both of these things were par for the course for World of Wonder. The very same issue also features a story, for example, about prisoners escaping from Mussolini's political prison on the island of Lipari, and it's written in much the same style. But it is verifiably true.
Chased down by Mussolini's pet squid.
Flying monkeys, yeah. That was just, I guess, the tone the magazine took to engage its young readers. The account ends with the statement, "Not surprisingly, Ferdinand Moxo never returned to the island. He recovered his reason and wrote a full report of his terrible experience." Which gives us an implied source, this report that he's supposed to have written. But still, with what little new information the article provided, I wasn't able to find anything further. Which was frustrating because, again, if I could find there was even a grain of truth to this, it would go a long way to giving all of these gigantic octopus legends some much needed support. As a last resort, I reached out to Dr. Carl Schucker on Twitter. Carl is a zoologist and cryptozoologist and the author of many, many books on the subject of mystery animals. I highly recommend his The Beasts That Hide From Man to anyone with an interest in the subject. It particularly covers a lot of lesser known cryptids that don't get a lot of attention. Really worth a read. So I asked him if he'd heard anything about this, if this case rang any bells. It didn't. He very kindly had a look over some of the older literature that he had access to. Nothing. So I was starting to think, okay, maybe we'll just never know. It's just another mystery for the podcast. And then Carl got back to me. He'd found the source of the report. A piece called The Horror of Serrana Cay in the April 1911 issue of Everybody's Story magazine, a pulp fiction magazine of the early 20th century. It was written by Henry MacDonald, an obscure writer of fantastic fiction in the 1910s. So obscure, in fact, that I've been unable to find any of his actual stories online, only a list of magazines in which 4 of his stories, including this one, were published. So, yeah, World of Wonder was bullshitting us all. In a magazine that was, at least in part, focused on science education. On this occasion, they were just throwing a load of big hairy bollocks into the pages and onto the cover of their magazine to sell copies. I've said it before, and sadly I'm sure I'll have to say it again, but fake news is nothing new. That's kind of it for the gigantic octopus. I wish I could end that part of the topic on some compelling, tantalising note, but the evidence for such a thing is pretty thin, it has to be said. The oceans are a vast and little explored world unto themselves, but until something a bit more substantial surfaces, you can put me in the skeptical camp on that. Of course, that's if 200 kilogram giant Pacific octopuses with a 30-foot span aren't already monster enough for you. So that does for octopuses. What of serpents?
Yes.
Sea serpents represent some of the oldest folklore of humanity. Tales of huge serpentine sea creatures are found in almost every culture on the planet, at least those with any sort of access to seas or large lakes, even those with apparently no contact with each other, from ancient Greece to the pre-Columbian Americas to Australian Aboriginal peoples, you name it. Is this because the idea of such creatures is just so primal and evocative to the human psyche that it's emerged in different places simultaneously? Might it be that the legends are just so ancient that they were already established when early human migrants dispersed out from sub-Saharan Africa tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, taking the seed of these stories with them across the world? Or might it be, at least partly, because such creatures do or have existed alongside mankind, and peoples all over the world have independently encountered them? Great sea serpents appear in the Book of Genesis, in the epic cycle of Greek and Roman mythology, where they kill Laocoon and his sons as punishment for trying to set fire to the Trojan horse. Even further back, there is the proto-mythology of the Chaos Kampf, struggle against chaos, which is a sort of mythological meme that's found repeatedly across many Eurasian cultures and beyond, usually in the form of a story involving a culture hero, god, or demigod battling an all-powerful serpent. Yamu and Baal in Canaanite mythology, Tiamat and Marduk to the Mesopotamians, Thor and Jormungandr to the Norse, Hercules and the Hydra to the Greeks, Susanoo and Yamata no Orochi in Japanese Shinto mythology, and many, many others. Arguably even the likes of Saint Columba and the aquatic monster in the River Ness, all suggesting that the roots of the story template lie at least as far back as the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and possibly further back still. More tangibly, the Greek geographer and philosopher Strabo, he sounds like somebody's mate from Glasgow. I went down the pub with Strabo and...
Sounds like an app. Hey, have you been on Strabo?
So Strabo wrote of a serpent washed up on the coast of what is now Syria about 100 BC, quote, "The corpse of which was about a plethrum in length, that's 30 metres or 100 feet, and so bulky that horsemen standing by it on either side could not see one another. Its jaws were large enough to admit a man on horseback. A globster, perhaps, like the St. Augustine carcass? Perhaps the remains of a whale or basking shark rotted beyond easy recognition? Maybe, but Strabo mentions some features that don't perfectly jive with that. Each flake of its horny scales exceeded an oblong shield in length. Sharks and whales don't have scales, certainly not of that scale. Most detailed reports of sea serpents, as in claimed first-hand sightings, encounters, seem to come from the 17th century onward, really up until the end of the 19th century. That was the heyday of the sea serpent. And I would say that's probably linked to the growth of timely print media, newspapers essentially. Prior to that, accounts would have been spread by word of mouth, entering into oral mythology. Print media allows at least some degree of stability in the story. It's not as limited by memory and things evolving over retellings, though, as we've seen already, it's not completely immune to those effects.
There's also, throughout that period as well, I think there's a resurgence of the sort of romantic hero in fiction as well. So you might find that there's a reoccurrence of taking mythic tropes and retelling them in a number of different ways.
Oh yeah, definitely, that's a good point. A famous case reported in the Times of London in 1848 was that of the HMS Daedalus, a Royal Navy warship en route to the island of St. Helena via the Cape of Good Hope, when Captain McWee and a number of...
I'm allowed to laugh at that name because it sounds like a Scottish name, alright?
It's Irish, I think.
Ah, well, I've got Irish family as well, and I'm still laughing at it. No. McWee.
McQuee. It's spelled in a really weird way.
Oh, you're saying McQuee. You're saying McQuee.
Yeah. Got a Q and then a whole load of vowels after it.
Ah, right. I thought it was McWee.
Yeah, it's pronounced like that.
She sounds like a wee guy called Mick.
Captain Mickey Wee and a number of his officers and crew observed an apparent sea serpent swimming with about 1.5 meters of its head and neck held up above the waves, and another 18 meters of it partly submerged in the sea. There are a couple of very famous illustrations of the creature based on the detailed eyewitness accounts, and they show a very long-bodied animal with a smallish head, a white underbelly visible where the head is raised from the water. There's almost a seal-like quality to it, but it's definitely not a seal, it's huge. There's been much debate about the identity of the Daedalus serpent over the years. Some have suggested the crew saw an oarfish, which is an extremely elongated deep-sea animal, known to grow to a whopping 8 meters in length, and quite possibly longer. These have often been mistaken for sea serpents. I say mistaken, although not serpent, as in snake. An 8 meter long lamprey-like fish pretty much is a sea serpent as far as I'm concerned. They are very uncommonly seen at the surface, much like huge deep-sea squid like Architeuthis and Mesonicoteuthis. Most sightings involve either dead animals washed up on the shoreline, injured and dying animals found near the surface, or specimens hauled up from the depths by trawlers. The giant oarfish was officially scientifically described in 1772 by Norwegian biologist Peter Ascanius. Prior to that, and for a long time after actually, beached oarfish would have quite simply been recorded as sea serpents. If you search for Navy SEALs oarfish or Toyon Bay oarfish online, you'll see images of people standing with 17 and 18 meter dead oarfish. These things are monsters. Absolute monsters. But while I think the oarfish probably does account for a lot of sea serpent sightings, and wider public knowledge of these animals might have contributed to the apparent drop in sea serpent sightings since the 20th century, I'm not sure it's a perfect fit in this case. Oarfish have completely different coloration to the animal described in the Daedalus case. Their bodies are coated in a layer of reflective silvery guanine, and I don't believe they would be able to hold their head up out of the water as described by the witnesses. They're deep-sea fish, they rely on the buoyancy of the water to hold them up. Alternatively, Dr. Gary Galbraith, an evolutionary biologist at Northwestern University in Illinois, suggests that the creature was in fact a say baleen whale. Now, this cetacean swims along at surface level with its mouth open to feed, with its lower jaw submerged, and the thin triangular top of its head poking up above the water, somewhat resembling the head of a serpent. This is a more convincing explanation than it sounds, particularly when you look at the eyewitness illustration of the Daedalus serpent alongside photos of these whales feeding. Though there is still a tiny part of me that's like, I feel these people would have probably known a whale when they saw one, but maybe not. You know, everyone's fallible. Suggestion has a huge impact on how you perceive things. A similar creature was spotted off the Portuguese coast by the crew of the HMS Plumper, which, what a name. What a name. HMS Big Boned. An officer wrote to the Illustrated London News, on the morning of the 31st of December 1848, being nearly due west of Oporto, I saw a long black creature with a sharp head moving slowly. I should think about 2 knots. Its back was about 20 feet, if not more, above water, and its head, as near as I could judge, from 6 to 8. There was something on its back that appeared like a mane, and as it moved through the water, kept washing about, but before I could examine it more closely, it was too far astern. The illustration that accompanied the article was very, very similar to the Daedalus serpent. Make of that what you will. But sea serpent sightings aren't just limited to random encounters at sea. Much like other cryptids, sometimes specific regions seem to develop associations with these monsters. For about 200 years, the Cape Ann area in Massachusetts was a particular hotspot for sea serpent sightings. At least as far back as the time of the Pilgrims and the earliest European settlers, there were reports and claims of encounters with dangerous serpentine animals here, as well as the suggestion that the Native American First Nations people were already well aware of these creatures. In John Joslin's An Account of 2 Voyages to New England, there is the following passage referring to an encounter that supposedly took place in 1638. They told me of a sea serpent or snake that lay coiled up like a cable upon a rock at Cape Ann. The boat passed by with 2 English on board and 2 Indians. They would have shot the serpent, but the Indians dissuaded them, saying that if they were not killed outright, they would be in danger of their lives. In the late 1810s, the Linnean Society of New England, the main science and natural history organisation in the area at the time, investigated a spate of sightings in the Cape Ann area, particularly centred around the harbour at the city of Gloucester and a little southwest of there at Nahant, with mass sightings taking place in 1817 and 1819. One eyewitness of the 1819 incident wrote in the issue of the United Service Journal, "I had with me an excellent telescope. When I reached the strand, I found many persons assembled, and soon afterward, I saw appear at a short distance from the shore an animal whose body formed a series of blackish curves, of which I counted 13. Other persons estimated the number at 15. The monster passed thrice at a moderate speed, traversing the bay, whose waters writhed in foam under its huge bulk. We could easily calculate that its length could not be less than 50 or 60 feet. This at least I can affirm, without presuming to say what species belongs the animal which I had just seen." Now, I think it's possible that some of these sightings were of unusual tidal phenomena, like standing waves similar to the seiches that sometimes occur on sea lochs given the appearance of humps on the water. There's also the suggestion that narwhals could have been responsible for some of the accounts, because in some sightings, but not others, the head of the animal is described as having a spear sticking up from its head. I also think it's possible, this being an area with a very rich maritime tradition, that sea serpent folklore was just so strong around here that you had people jumping at every unusual thing in the sea, and these sightings were actually of a number of different things. The members of the Linnean Society were not of that opinion, however. As far as they were concerned, the descriptions were consistent enough and widely enough witnessed that they took the step of proclaiming the serpent an entirely new genus, the Scoliophus atlanticus. According to their committee, quote, "The affidavits of a great many individuals of unblemished character are collected, which leaves no room to apprehend anything like deceit. They do not agree in every minute particular, but in regard to its great length and snake-like form they are harmonious. An animal of similar appearance was again seen in August 1819 off Nahant, Boston, and remained in the neighbourhood for some weeks. 200 persons witnessed it, 13 folds were counted, and the head, which was serpent-shaped, was elevated 2 feet above the surface. Its eye was remarkably brilliant and glistening, the water was smooth, the weather calm and serene. When it disappeared, its motion was undulatory."
200 people, did you say?
200 people, yep. And that was just one mass sighting. Over the years, there were several. Reports came pretty consistently through the 19th century. It seems like maybe every decade or two there was at least one big mass sighting around Cape Ann. By the time the 20th century arrived, though, things had begun to trail off, and in fact, numbers of sea serpent sightings in general seemed to have slightly diminished after that point. They didn't go away, but just compared to the peak of interest in the 19th century, the relative frequency of reports seems to have dropped. A number of reasons have been suggested for why that might have been. Maybe people were just a bit more skeptical. Perhaps also the advent of photography had a chilling effect, the ability to capture an image and then analyse it in detail, to put your sighting in front of an expert who can actually look at it and say, no, that's a such and such. It allows sightings to be definitively debunked because you have an objective record of what was seen, unclouded by memory or bias. I think there might have been an element of that, but I'm not sure I buy that it made much difference. In fact, if anything, the advent of photography gave other phenomena, like the Loch Ness Monster, for example, a massive boost. Photographs, even hoaxed pictures, were what put that particular cryptid on the world stage. Completely the opposite effect. One theory I find curious, and I'm not saying I believe in it wholeheartedly, but it does get the old cogs turning, stems from the observation that the decline of the sea serpent broadly coincided with the end of the age of sail and the rise and dominance of huge engine-driven ships. Now, the effects of anthropogenic noise pollution on animals, and marine life in particular, have come under close study only in the last few years. Sound waves carry much more strongly underwater than they do in the air. This effect is what allows whales, for example, to communicate with one another over thousands of miles of ocean. But it also means that there are very few places on Earth that aren't now subject to considerable amounts of low-frequency, man-made underwater noise from industry, resource extraction such as oil drilling, and perhaps most of all, loud motorised shipping. And this is something that has generally been rising year on year since the 19th century. The impact of all this noise varies widely depending on the species. Some species of animals are much more profoundly affected than others. There are a wealth of studies, particularly involving land animals, but a few focusing on sea life, showing that man-made noise pollution is perceived as threatening by a wide range of species. It increases psychological and physiological stress. It causes mice, for example, to undertake vigilant and anti-predator behaviours at the expense of foraging for food and self-care, worsening their overall health and condition. Noise pollution can scare away prey that an animal relies on for sustenance, or, in some cases, can scare away the predator but not the prey, forcing the predator into quieter but perhaps less hospitable territory with less prey, impacting that predator's survival chances. Animals that rely heavily on sound for hunting or social cues, marine mammals are one major example of this, can be disadvantaged in a range of activities necessary for the long-term survival of the species, potentially even affecting their ability to find one another for mating purposes. So the theory suggested by cryptozoologist Paul Harrison, among others, contends that there is, or was, a distinct unknown species of giant sea serpent that was once semi-common around inhabited coasts, but has, for one reason or another, been pushed to extinction by anthropogenic noise pollution from modern shipping, or at least pushed to more remote areas of the sea, far from the busy shipping lanes around high population areas where they were once found, such as the British Isles or Cape Ann on the New England coast. Admittedly, it does feel a bit like a cross between the God of the Gaps and Lisa Simpson's anti-tiger rock. We must always remember that correlation does not imply causation. I'm not asking anyone to subscribe to this idea, but just from a curiosity perspective, I do find it interesting because it calls upon something that's very topical and only just beginning to be understood, and on a grander scale, just thinking about noise pollution or other kinds of pollution and their effects on real known animals. Even if it's not the case for so-called sea serpents, what else might it be affecting? Might we have unknowingly pushed other species of megafauna, not yet scientifically documented, but perhaps known anecdotally as monsters or folkloric beasts, either to complete extinction or to more and more remote habitats due to our own actions, be that noise pollution, light pollution, chemical pollution, whatever? Or along similar lines, might these kinds of pollution be having an impact on the size that known large animals can grow to? Take once again the example of the giant Pacific octopus. I mentioned before that the largest specimen recorded according to the Smithsonian Institute was 600 pounds, 275 kilograms, and had a 30-foot, 9-metre arm span, the height of a 3-storey building. I haven't been able to find a precise date for this, but it was certainly not a recent discovery. James Cosgrove and Neil McDaniel, in the 2009 book Super Suckers, the Giant Pacific Octopus and Other Cephalopods of the Pacific Coast, record a 402 pound, 182 kilogram octopus caught in 1945 off Santa Barbara, with photographic evidence, which we don't have for the 600 pounder. What's interesting is no specimen has been found even approaching this size since the mid-20th century. Cosgrove and McDaniel interviewed dozens of octopus fishermen for that book, and not one reported catching an animal larger than 57 kilograms in the last 20 years. That's just a little over 1/6 of the weight of the largest historical specimen, and much less than a third of the weight of the more well-documented Santa Barbara specimen from 1945. Roland Anderson, a biologist at Seattle Aquarium until 2009, had been searching since the late 70s for a 100-pound, 45-kilogram specimen in the wild that he might be able to raise to a truly huge size in captivity as an attraction for the aquarium. 100-pound octopus, very, very big octopus, but according to the literature, well within the range of what these animals are supposed to reach based on historical data. In his entire career, Roland Anderson was unable to find one. By free-feeding smaller immature specimens, he was able to raise one in the aquarium to a peak weight of 43 kilograms, 95 pounds. He began to suspect that the giant Pacific octopus was now topping out at a much smaller size than it used to, due to the bioaccumulation of toxicants in their system. Anderson found high levels of PCBs and heavy metals in the digestive systems of wild octopuses, which probably stemmed from the red rock crab, one of their preferred prey items, and an animal particularly known for accumulating pollutants from its environment. Anderson then performed a study published in 2003 showing that giant Pacific octopus fed in captivity on wild red rock crab not only had much higher concentrations of heavy metals in their systems than the same species fed only other seafood, but grew to a much smaller size. So this is chemical pollution we're talking about here, but it raises the interesting question: might we have killed off, scared off, or shrunken down some of our sea monsters without even knowing it?
It's also possible that we've somehow affected the food chain in a different way, and
overfishing.
Highly speculative, but if you think about the things that maybe we classically think of as sea monsters, octopuses, or things that look like serpents, but imagine there's something else in the water that wouldn't normally prey upon these things, and then because we've messed everything up, the entire food chain goes, and those animals then suddenly start to thin out. I wouldn't put it past orcas to be able to take down things like that.
Oh yeah, it's a complex intertwined web of connections, and you upset one thing, but this topic is not giant sea monsters shrink, it's not giant sea monsters are seen, it's giant sea monsters attack, right? So before we wrap up this episode, I want to cover two supposed incidents of sea serpents, attacking. In the journal The Zoologist, volume 18, published in 1860, you can find this: the giant sea serpent. The following extract from the log of the British Banner, which arrived at Liverpool on Sunday the 18th of March last, appeared in the Liverpool Daily Post of March 20th. On the 25th of April, in latitude 12 degrees 7 south and longitude 93.52 east, felt a strong sensation as if the ship were trembling. Sent second mate to see what was up. The latter called out to me to go up to the fore-rigging and look over the bows. I did so and saw an enormous serpent shaking the bowsprit with its mouth. There was about 30 feet of the serpent out of the water, and I could see its tail in the water abaft of our stern. Must have been at least 300 feet long, was about the circumference of a very wide crinoline petticoat, with black back, shaggy mane, horn on his forehead, and large glaring eyes placed rather near the nose. The jaws about 8 feet long. He did not observe me and continued to shake the bowsprit and to throw the sea alongside into a foam until the former came clear away from the ship. So the thing has actually snapped off the bowsprit at the front of the ship. The spike at the front of the ship has been ripped off. The serpent was powerful enough, although the ship was carrying all sail and going at about 6 knots at the time he attacked us, to stop her way completely. When the bowsprit with the jibboom sails and rigging went by the board, the monster swallowed the top foremost staysail and flying jib with the greatest apparent ease. He also snapped the thickest of the rigging asunder like thread. He sheered off a little after this, and returned apparently to scratch himself against the side of the ship, making a most extraordinary noise resembling that on board a steamer when the boilers are blowing off. A whale breached within a mile of the ship at this time, and the serpent darted off after it like a flash of lightning, striking the vessel with its tail and staving in all the starboard quarter galley. Saw no more of it, but caught a young one in the afternoon and brought it on to Melbourne. William Taylor, Master, British Banner.
They caught a young one?
Yeah, so we're going to come to that. The British Banner arrived here on Sunday and is now in the Albert Dock. Captain Taylor declares that the above statement is perfectly correct, and then the editor goes on to say, "It is impossible for any story to read more like a hoax than this, but I had ready means of procuring through a friend at Lloyd's the information that there is such a ship as the British Banner, that she is commanded by a Mr. William Taylor, a respectable and trustworthy gentleman, and that she did arrive at Liverpool on Sunday the 18th of March last past and is now in the Albert Dock. Armed with this information, I wrote to Captain Taylor, who has replied in the most courteous manner. He confirms the above statement, adding that he sent it to the Daily Post himself, and adding also that the young one reported to have been caught was presented to the Museum of Melbourne, where it was thoroughly inspected and pronounced to be a veritable sea serpent." Edward Newman, a correspondent of the Journal. The description of this creature matches almost eerily the serpents described in the Cape Ann, Gloucester Harbour sightings, despite this being pretty much the opposite side of the planet from there, just off the Cocos Islands in the Indian Ocean, en route to Australia. As the editor notes there, the idea of a sea serpent stopping a ship in its tracks seems absolutely wild. It's like something from an old woodcut, that kind of thing. But what of this supposed young specimen that the captain claims to have captured and had verified as a sea serpent by the Museum of Melbourne? Kind of a strange addition to the story, potentially key to being able to verify the authenticity of the tale. Well, Edward Newman didn't leave it there. In a later issue of The Zoologist from the same year, we find the following correspondence from him. Captain Taylor's Sea Serpent. A friend who had the opportunity of communicating with Melbourne on the subject of the young sea serpent which Captain Taylor says he presented to the museum at Melbourne, has ascertained through Mr. Coates of that town that Captain Taylor is so far correct that he did at the time specified present a specimen of Pelarace bicolour to the museum in question, and Professor McCoy exhibited the same to Mr. Coates. Of course, there is no rational ground for concluding that this small sea snake is the young of any such gigantic creature as Captain Taylor has described. So, Taylor had delivered a specimen to the university claiming it to be the young of a sea serpent, a specimen that the university identified as a common tropical sea snake. It's not looking great. One wonders what the captain's motivation is here. Was he perhaps similar to what some have speculated in the case of UB-85? Is he trying to cover up for his own negligence in allowing the ship to become damaged by some other means? Was it some kind of insurance scam? With sea serpents being a hot topic at the time, maybe it seemed a good thing to blame damage on something that was safely out with the expected control of a sea captain, as opposed to running the ship up against a cliff or something. Or just maybe there's some slim chance they did indeed encounter a huge sea serpent. Whatever the truth, nothing more seems to have been heard of the larger serpent in the case. As a result of the sea snake episode, however, the British Banner encounter is generally considered to be a hoax of some kind. Now, we've said that sea serpent reports diminished in the 20th century, but they didn't completely go away. For the final case I'm going to talk about tonight, we're heading back to Florida, but about 300 miles or so west of St. Augustine to the city of Pensacola in the Florida Panhandle, close to the border with Alabama. And this, I'm sorry to say, is quite a sad tale. On March the 26th, 1962, the Ocala Star-Banner published the following story. 4 teenage skin divers still missing after raft is abandoned. The 4 teenagers were Bradford Rice, 14, Warren Felly, 16, Eric Ryle, 16, and Larry Stewart Bill, 17. They, along with Edward Brian McCleary, 16, were skin diving from a raft in the Gulf of Mexico when the tide began carrying them out to sea. McCleary was found sleeping on a beach the next day. The raft washed ashore with face masks, shoes, and fins inside. McCleary says the boys tried to moor the raft to a buoy, after which they abandoned the raft and attempted to swim to shore. He says that he, Bill, and Royal separated while swimming to shore. The Pensacola News-Journal went into a little more detail. 4 Fort Walton Beach teenagers are missing and presumed drowned in the Gulf of Mexico off Fort Pickens after a spearfishing trip Saturday from which apparently only one escaped. Brian McCleary, 16, drifted and swam more than 2 miles through rough Gulf waters Saturday afternoon after he and 4 companions decided to leave their rubber life raft, which was being swept to sea. Missing are Eric Ryle, 16, son of Air Force Major and Mrs. Ralph J. Ryle, 103 Allen Drive, Fort Walton Beach; Bradford J. Rice, 14, son of Mr. and Mrs. J. W. Rice, 10 Circle Drive; Warren R. Sally, 17, parents unknown, of 720 Beale Drive; Larry Stewart Bill, 15, parents unknown, of 172 Monaghan Avenue. McCleary, son of Mr. and Mrs. Edward McCleary, Fort Walton Beach, was picked up near Fort McRae at about 7:45 a.m. Sunday by helicopter from the Naval Air Station after spending the night in an old gun emplacement. He suffered from shock and exposure, but was released to his parents after brief treatment at the Naval Air Station Hospital. Now, it explains that the boys were pulled out by an unexpected current. They left their swamped raft and gradually became separated from one another until only McCleary made it to shore. Goes on. Sometime after dark, about 6 hours after the trip had begun, Brian touched sand and struggled ashore at Fort McCree. He thought he was on Santa Rosa Island and tried to find Fort Pickens, but after wandering around he crawled into the gun emplacement and fell asleep. It goes on to describe the extensive search and rescue efforts that were launched to find the missing boys, and that Major Ralph Ryle, the father of Eric Ryle, one of the boys who didn't make it, was aboard the very helicopter that eventually airlifted Edward Brian McCleary from the beach at Fort McCree.
Oh man.
Heartbreaking. Exactly a week later, a body was discovered washed ashore about a mile west of Fort McCree by a Frank Nielsen of Gulf Beach Highway. The body was later identified as Bradford Rice. He was returned to his mother and buried in Beale Memorial Cemetery on the 2nd of April. The bodies of the remaining 3 were never recovered, as far as I can determine. A tragic event by any measure. There's no overstating how much of a tragedy this must have been for the families and the local community in general. As horrible as it is, though, there's nothing inherently mysterious about youngsters drowning in an accident at sea. It's a catastrophe, yeah, but one that sadly has played out thousands of times before, and it probably hasn't happened for the last time either. After search and rescue efforts were abandoned, this incident didn't garner a lot of attention out with the local community. Not, that is, until 3 years later, when the lone survivor, Edward Brian McCleary, submitted an account of his ordeal to Fate magazine in the spring of 1965, an account that included a large amount of additional detail about the events of that day, some of which could completely alter the interpretation of what happened to the 4 missing boys. According to the account printed in Fate, that Saturday, March the 24th, 1962, the 5 friends set out in a 7-foot Air Force surplus raft towards the wreck of the USS Massachusetts. This was an Indiana-class battleship from the turn of the 20th century that upon decommissioning in 1921 was used as a target in a test of experimental anti-ship artillery and sunk on a sandbar about 2 miles out from shore. The wreck became an artificial reef and came into use as a popular shallow water dive site, and this was the goal of the 5 boys that day. The weather, when they set out, was pleasant. The water was flat, calm. It was, as McCleary described it, a perfect day for skin diving. Skin diving, for those not in the know, is an older term for ad hoc free diving, kind of diving humans have been doing since our earliest coastal ancestors realised clams were a tasty treat. No tanks or breathing apparatus, just a lungful of air, maybe some goggles and a set of fins if you're lucky. The wreck lies in shallow water. At low tide, parts of it breach the surface, so you can explore it without any special training or equipment. Point being, these weren't professional divers or extreme sports enthusiasts. These were just some outdoor kids out for a day's adventure, hoping to maybe catch a few fish. Unfortunately, as we now know, it was about to turn deadly. The weather turned, the sky clouded over, and the wind began to pick up. The boys went from paddling across a smooth sea to bobbing around like a cork on choppy waves. What was normally an easy, chilled paddle in the Gulf was turning into a battle against the elements, and so they decided to call it a day and head back to the beach. But the sea wasn't on their side. Despite their best efforts, the wind and the tide started to pull them away from shore. 2 of the boys climbed into the sea to push the raft while the others paddled, but the current continued to drag them further and further away from land. past the wreck and out into open water. A moment of hope came upon them when they saw a boat passing nearby through the squall. They waved to it for help, but the pilot either ignored them or simply failed to spot them. Then they tried to tie the raft to a large marker buoy placed to warn ships off from the nearby wreck, but the thing was bouncing around so much in the waves that the kids actually had to leap clear of the thing to avoid being dashed against it. They managed to recover their raft and bail out the worst of the water, but they were utterly helpless against the relentless current. On top of everything else, it began to rain. As twilight fell, the ocean calmed, the rain stopped, and in its place came a low sea fog and an eerie, deathly stillness. According to McCleary, at this point Bradford Rice stated, "We're dead. We died in that storm." The others tried to reassure him, but it's obvious that with the onset of darkness, fear and despair arrived. They were considering another attempt to make for shore when Larry Bill called for quiet. He heard something in the fog, a boat maybe, out beyond the range of their visibility. Something splashed. Moments later, the wake from whatever was moving out there struck their raft and almost capsized them again. A strong odour of dead fish came seemingly out of nowhere, and through the fog they spotted an object sticking up about 10 feet, 2.5 metres out of the water, which McCleary described as looking like a telephone pole with a bulb-shaped protrusion on top. This object then stooped and dived beneath the surface, revealing itself to be the apparent head and neck of some huge sea creature. A high-pitched whining sound pealed out through the dim fog, and the boys, now in a panic, donned their fins and began swimming desperately for the shore, through water that had now turned fetid and brown, covered in floating crusts of slime. Strange hissing sounds echoed around them. With the easing of the wind and tide, it seems that the boys made good progress at first. The fog started to clear. Then McCleary heard a scream from behind. He heard Warren Felly shouting, "It's got Brad." Then he too fell silent. Now it was just McCleary, Bill, and Royal. A few minutes later, McCleary noticed only he and Royal remained at the surface. Soon the upper section of the wreck came into view. They were approaching the USS Massachusetts dive site, probably halfway to shore from where they'd started swimming. A flash of lightning gave McCleary a clear glimpse of Royal swimming a few metres in front of him. Suddenly, the pole shape was back, rising up ahead of McCleary, then coming crashing down into the water, apparently taking Eric Royal down with it. McCleary carried on swimming in a fevered daze and eventually reached the shoreline. In his fate account, he claimed to have little to no coherent memory of events between the loss of Royal and then finding himself in hospital. The version he provided local newspapers at the time of the event, which didn't mention a monster, does include a fragmentary memory of him wandering the beach in confusion, falling asleep in what he thought was a lifeguard shelter but was actually an abandoned gun emplacement, waking the following morning and being told by two boys on the beach about the huge search that was being organised to find him and his friends, and then being airlifted out. Apart from this, the fate encounter chimes closely with original newspaper accounts in almost every way except the obvious. When the story was first reported in the mainstream press, there was no mention of a sea serpent. They tell of the boys abandoning the raft and struggling to swim to shore, suffering cramps, etc., but no monster. Well, the Fate article addresses this. It claims that McCleary did indeed share his account of the monster while being treated at the Naval Hospital. E. McGovern, director of Escambia County Search and Rescue, who as it happens was also mentioned in some of the contemporary news reports, apparently listened in amazement as the boy recounted the story of the serpent or plesiosaur or whatever the hell it was, but then counselled him to exclude this part when he spoke to the press, either because he thought it was a figment of the boy's traumatised imagination or because it would be harder on the boy and the families in the long run if word got around that he was claiming to have been attacked by a sea monster. According to McCleary, McGovern told him, "The sea has a lot of secrets. There are a lot of things we don't know about. People don't believe in these things because they're afraid to. Yes, I believe you, but there's not much else I can do. Now that is McCleary himself's claim about it. We don't have anything direct from McGovern on that, but we do know this was a guy that existed and did hold that job. So there's a few different ways to interpret this. At face value, the boys were attacked by a large unknown sea creature resembling a sea serpent. Maybe they were. E.E. McGovern is no doubt absolutely correct if he did indeed say the sea has a lot of secrets. We could be looking at something that typically avoids humans and has therefore avoided study and has itself been disturbed by this freak squall that threw the boys off course, leading it to attack the dinghy. Remember also that these kids were using a small non-motorised boat. Perhaps their silent approach in low visibility led to them startling something that usually does its level best to stay well away from people, and this is the result. It's not likely, in my opinion, but is it remotely possible? Sure. But the Fate article mentions something important about McCleary's state of mind in the weeks following the event. The boy, not surprisingly, given everything that's happened to him, suffered a complete mental breakdown and was unable to participate in normal life for a full 3 months after his rescue. This opens the door to the suggestion that the monster story was a sort of mental health delusion born of survivor's guilt, offering a way of exonerating any feeling he might have that he, didn't do enough to help his companions as they struggled to swim to shore.
Yeah.
Not that I think that would be a valid thought to have about himself in such circumstances. Very likely if he'd have done any more than he already did, he too might have drowned. But the human mind finds ways to torture itself over these things. And if there's a giant marine animal dragging your friends down, something so powerful you stand no chance against it whatsoever, there's no ifs or buts there. You can see how that might be an easier pill to swallow than my friends drowned because they got tired out and their limbs cramped up. What if I'd tried this or done that? Could I have saved them? A monster almost makes it feel more like an act of God,
Yeah.
Alternatively, a cynic might suggest that McCleary, 3 years after his ordeal, saw an opportunity to make bank on it by selling the story to Fate with some added paranormal spice.
You never know what people's financial situations are.
That is very true, and I think it is possible, but I'm not particularly convinced. The reason being, there's plenty of magazines around, and certainly at that time, that would have paid for a tragic, true life, swept out to sea adventure story without the sea monster. And I'm not even sure Fate actually paid much, if anything, for stories. There is one more possible explanation that doesn't involve either delusion or dishonesty. And it takes us back to something that we touched upon earlier in this episode. The baleen whales, particularly in this case the North Atlantic right whale. Like the say baleen whale that we mentioned as a possible explanation for the Daedalus serpent, the North Atlantic right whale is a filter feeder whose upper jaw forms a narrow rostrum that can stick high up out of the water when feeding. This rostrum terminates in a bulb-like shape that is often covered in callosities and barnacles that can be mistaken for eyes and other facial features. These are a critically endangered species, but they do feed and breed off Florida. It would actually explain a surprising amount of the phenomena described. The hissing sound could have been an exhalation from its blowhole. The fishy smell could have been its breath or other excretions. The brown, crusty material could have been guess. A biologist going by the Reddit username Northern Sparrow on an old thread on Our Biology where the subject was raised, wrote, "It rises mysteriously up out of the water, glides along, turns side to side sometimes, sinks back down without a trace. In the right or wrong light, the baleen can look almost invisible and all you see is the skinny top part, which looks remarkably like a head and neck. The size, 10 feet long, and motion, rising up, gliding along, sinking back down, matches McCleary's description. And North Atlantic right whales do occur off Florida in the month that he saw it, March. They were still quite rare in the 1960s and we had not yet discovered their calving grounds. Turns out the calf off Florida, in fact. So it would have been a rare enough sighting that McCleary wouldn't have known this was a possible explanation. What's more is these critically endangered animals are known to be extremely curious, friendly and playful when encountering humans in the water. Right whales have been known to pick up swimmers and kayakers and give them rides on their backs without any prompting. So the heartbreaking thing is, it's entirely possible that this was a North Atlantic right whale or a pod of North Atlantic right whales that approached these boys with friendly curiosity, and because of the stress of the situation and their misidentification of these animals, the boys panicked, lost control, and drowned. The tragic irony being, if this was a North Atlantic right whale, when McCleary saw the animal approaching his friends, it might well have been doing nothing more sinister than trying to initiate play.
Yeah. Or, I mean, if you want to anthropomorphise things, maybe it was even trying to help.
It could have been. That's a good point. Cetaceans, these things are mammals. They have, based on their own instincts towards their own calves.
Yeah.
There's accounts of whales taking injured dolphins and taking them to join their pods and things like that. So, yeah, I don't think it's particularly anthropomorphizing to say that these animals might actually have been trying to assist the boys in distress. Of course, this is all just another theory. We really don't know for sure what it was, or if indeed it was anything at all. McCleary himself passed away in 2016 at the age of 70, and unfortunately I think any hope of further insights into this strange and haunting case probably passed with him, the sole survivor of the Pensacola sea monster. While it might seem that each case we've looked at individually has had a range of possible mundane explanations, it might seem we are tearing down the idea of unknown animals, the idea of new discoveries to be made. I want to be very clear that that couldn't be further from the truth. The fact that these stories have a range of explanations, the fact that they are all contentious in one way or another, is what makes them mysterious, and it's what makes them good material for Talk Until Dawn. New sea creatures are discovered all the time, usually small invertebrates or slight variations on known animals. Not always though. First encounters with fantastical new animals do happen. It's just that when this is extensively photographed, recorded, quantified, and scientifically documented, they don't become a creepy word-of-mouth story. They don't usually find their way into mysteries of the unexplained. They become a research paper. Take, for example, the megamouth shark. No one had any inkling there existed a giant 5-meter, freakish-looking, filter-feeding deep-sea shark that only approaches the surface at night, until by sheer chance one became entangled in the anchor of a US Navy vessel off Hawaii in 1976. If that megamouth shark entangled in the anchor had got away and had not been killed in the process and then subsequently been dissected and then studied, the megamouth shark might now just be a story doing the rounds of cryptozoology sites. It might just have been a sighting. I might be sitting here and going, well, it was probably just a deformed basking shark or something. Even now, with this being a known species and scientists actively looking for them and trying to track them with radio tags and whatnot, only a small number have ever been seen or caught in the half-century since their discovery. I'm pretty sure it's like double figures. Or take the colossal slickhead fish, a completely new apex predator discovered by the Japan Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology in 2016 in a heavily fished and otherwise believed to be very well understood part of the Sea of Japan. The formal classification of this animal didn't happen until January this year, last month. There are definitely still discoveries being made and large creatures still to be found. According to America's National Ocean Service, over 90% of animal species in the sea are yet to be classified. The majority, of course, will be things like microscopic worms, tiny arthropods, new forms of plankton.
Microscopic worms, that's almost as bad. Getting into your pores, eating you from the inside out.
Crawl up your arse and have a party.
Yeah.
It's almost beyond doubt that some very small percentage of those will be large, even very large creatures, perhaps different enough to familiar animals to be described by some as monsters. And in the whole of recorded history, I think it's quite likely that some of these unknown creatures will have had rare interactions with humans, and that these encounters entered into monster lore. In fact, we have a known example of that happening in the case of the giant squid before that animal was formally described by science. Granted, that all probably accounts for a tiny minority of monster reports overall. Most are probably misidentifications of existing animals, exaggerations, tall tales, hoaxes of various kinds, but I don't see it as a question of if some sea monster claims are genuinely examples of encounters with unknown animals. I see it as a question of which ones. I'll finish up with this topic for now by reminding you all of the words of Captain M.F. Bouyer, skipper of the French corvette Electon, as we described in the previous episode. Witness and chronicler to one of the first recorded modern encounters with the animal now known to science as Architeuthis dux. The sea has not spoken its last words yet. It keeps in its depths specimens of extinct races, or elaborates in its ever-working crucible untold monsters for the terror of the sailors, and the subjects of mysterious legends of the sea. Sea monsters, Michael!
Wonderful. It's a wonderful topic. There's undoubtedly things down there that we haven't found yet. I do remember the case where the great white shark that was tagged, that seemed to be eaten off of Australia, and then descended very, very fast into the depths, and then they found the tag later on. Did we talk about that?
I don't know if we did.
Some people say, it was eaten by, funnily enough, what we said before, by an orca.
Right.
But this was a huge great white, and something attacked it and immediately dragged it hundreds.
Jesus.
I don't know what the exact measurement was, but fast, way deep into the depths.
That's one of those ones where the hairs in the back of your arm goes up.
The official account, I think, is that it was probably an orca, but they don't really know what it was. All they know is it was something that was big enough. I think some people wondered if maybe a large squid or something like that, but it was something large enough and powerful enough to drag an animal like that down. But like, I've spent a little bit of time far off the coast on ships and boats, and when you're far from land and you look out, especially at night, there's something captivating about the sea. It's limitless, but it's also frightening. I think I mentioned that my dad used to always say to me that if I would go out in a boat, or if I was going away somewhere and I was going to be near the sea, my dad always said, remember son, respect the sea. And he always said that to me, and because it's like it'll swallow you up. And he used to tell stories. Some of my family live down in Cornwall, which is kind of steeped in Celtic myths and smugglers and pirates. Just, it has that whole vibe to it. It's wonderful. So my dad used to holiday down there when he was a kid. So this would have been in the 50s. And he used to get taken out by his uncle on like fishing boats. Sometimes they would sleep in the boat overnight, and I can't remember what they were fishing. I don't know if it was herring or something like that. But anyway, he used to tell me stories that those fishermen used to tell him, which was that basking sharks would appear in the area, and that there were instances when they had collided with people. And you see a picture of a basking shark and you see the big gaping mouth. Even though they're so sensitive, they're not going to want anything large to go near their mouth. And I think there was an instance in Scotland, where I think it was a boat that it capsized.
Oh, Jesus. My dad's got a kind of wild story about a basking shark. When he was a little boy, he was in the sea cadets. And one of these sadistic things they used to do to kids, they took them all out on a boat, 2 boats, and they ran a rope between the 2 boats at maybe half a mile's distance. They're way out in the Firth of Clyde, equidistant between probably Ayr, Arran and the Mull of Galloway, so quite far out in the sea. And they basically told these young boys, talking maybe 10 years old, climb down into the open ocean, hold on to this rope and pull yourself across this rope to the other boat half a mile away. So these boys started filing down and pulling themselves along the rope. So I think my dad's like maybe halfway in the middle of this line of boys travelling between the 2 boats. And from behind, he starts hearing screams from the other boys in the water. So one starts screaming, another starts screaming, and it starts travelling up the rope towards my dad, all these screams. There's something here, something in the water. And my dad's like frightened, but there's nothing he can do. There's people in front of him. He's quite far from both of the boats. And then he feels something brushing against his leg under the water. And he looks down and there's this huge black shape just moving along under the surface of the water, and it was a basking shark. think it just came up out of curiosity and kind of rubbed against them all. Yeah.
Yes. I just googled that there on my phone. The only known human deaths involving basking sharks were in the Firth of Clyde, when a breaching shark capsized a small boat and 3 of the men on board drowned. Just when you were talking about those poor guys trying to get out of that terrible situation, and something surfaces, and I know it doesn't match the descriptions, but I just mean that it's possible, you know, that this seems to be something that has happened.
Yeah. One way or the other, you don't want to panic when you're in the ocean.
Oh, no.
Panicking when you're in the ocean can kill you, whether you have reason to panic or not.
Yeah.
If you panic because of a mistaken identity of something that you've seen, that can be just as dangerous.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. Another weird story that someone told me, and it was Gemma's stepdad. Hi, Wilson, if you're listening. He was a fisherman on the east coast of Scotland, and I asked him what was the strangest thing he ever saw at sea, and he said, quick as a flash, pink elephant. And I laughed, thinking he's making a joke about them all being pissed while they're out fishing. He's like, no, a pink elephant. And he said, well, obviously they've got these huge big trawl nets, right?
Yeah.
And they reeled in the nets, and there was something really, really heavy in the net. What the hell is this? What have we snagged? And they pulled up a huge pink elephant out of the water. Rotting pink elephant.
Oh, God.
And it turns out, this was, a few decades ago now, I think, a travelling circus had one of its elephants die, and they knocked it off the cliffs at St Abb's Head. They pushed it off the cliffs and into the sea.
Oh, man.
And this
Can you
was
imagine
what they
finding
caught.
that?
I know, yeah. Wild, utterly wild. So, stranger things happen at sea.
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, that was the whole basking shark thing. It just reminds me that there are things in the water that can be quite benign, but just because they dwarf us so much, it would be so easy for us to become victims. And also the fact that in the sea can be very difficult unless you're trained to gauge the size of something.
Yeah, there's not a lot of things you can judge relative size.
Even experts don't have a point of reference. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, it's always put the fear of God into me. So thank you for bringing that back to the fore again.
Yeah, go and have a bath to relax.
Yeah, oh God, there's something about the depths of the sea that both fascinate and terrify me. And this episode has done nothing to quell that fear. so thank you.
Yeah. I don't have a full list of thanks and stuff that I usually do at the end of these episodes. Usually I go through all the reviews and nice comments and stuff that everyone's sent. Not really had time to put that together for this episode. We'll do it next time. While I remember though, because I've been meaning to do this for ages and I keep forgetting, I just wanted to say hello and thank you to Spook Daddy over on the Fortiana forums, who's been a great champion of Talking Till Dawn over there. I think he emailed us a while ago, remember, Mike?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
I think he's turned about 4 or 5 people on to Talking Till Dawn, so thank
great.
you. I've been meaning to sign up to the Fortiana forums to drop by and say hello, but I don't know, I think because I was using a VPN, for some reason, like their anti-spam filter thought I was a bot, so I've had some kind of problems signing up for an account. I've not been able to drop by into the actual thread to say hello, but thanks for all the kind words, and I hope you enjoy this episode. And if you have enjoyed this episode, or if you enjoy our episodes in general, please do subscribe to Talking Till Dawn wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching us on YouTube, subscribe and click the little bell icon to make sure you get notified when new episodes are posted. And tell your friends, spread the word, tell people that you enjoy it. And but most of all, thank you just for listening.
It was my pleasure, man.
Shut up, you. No, thank you for listening as well, Michael. And thank you for talking. But I think the sun is coming up.
The sun is coming up.
I think it's time for us to go. We've been talking for 2.5 hours.
I know.
And my throat hurts. Bye, everyone.
Good night, everyone.